Time for wall tile. You're going to want to apply the mastic to the wall when you do these little mats like this. Otherwise, it's just going to creep into all of those cracks and make a disgusting mess. I'm starting here so that the top can be nice and flush with the top of that backsplash. Once I have nice straight lines and have these sitting where I want them, I just use a grout float to push all those pieces evenly into that bed of mud. I put the mastic on the back of the tiles most of the time. It gives me the most control. I've had people ask me before, you know, why did you start there? Why don't you start at the bottom and work your way up like I'm laying bricks or something? Well, for one thing, I have never been able to trust my layout quite that much. Anyway, I'm going to transfer this layout all the way around and make both sides symmetrical to the shower. Now that mat, it needs a little bit of help to be flush with those big 12 by 24s. So it gets a scratch coat and then another bed on top of that. It's nice in these tight little spaces to have a margin trowel. Very helpful. I don't actually have a margin float, but this door sham works fine. It's all good. All you need to do is get them, you know, pushed in evenly. In a tight little space like this, where the tiles can't really go left or right, all you need is a screw to keep them from sliding down. All right, day 2. I pull out all of yesterday's spacers because it helps me know what is set and what is still setting up. That's very helpful with a big floor, let you know where you can walk. Now, where these tiles meet the floor, I don't want an 1/8" joint down there. I don't want much of a joint at all because it's going to get grout caulk. I always do that in all the inside corners and where they meet other surfaces because regular grout is just going to crack. On to the shower. I start with the first full row from the bottom and work my way up. I have that masking tape on the wall. That marks my inside corner shelves, and I also have an inlay back there. I want this shelf to split the seam. I want it to go right in that grout joint. And so I'm actually going to cut all 4 tiles that touch it. You could, you know, just set one row and set it on top of those and then use a wedge in the inside corner, but who wants that? This inlay is just like the mat on the walls in that it needs to be flushed out. So it needs this extra layer. This is a scratch coat. Put that on there and I will let that dry overnight. I like to mark these 3 tiles together as they sit mocked up in place. It makes them nice and even because my inlay, which is, you know, the focal point of the room, is going to sit on those 3 tiles on that cut. So I want that perfect. This inlay is going to kind of look like a window. Now when I set this bed of mud, rather than going left to right with my scratch marks, I'm going to go up and down. I think you can tell why. You could go on a bias, you know, go diagonally. That'd be fine too. Anyway, once that's set in place, I can start putting in the mat that will make up my inlay. This strip here is just the band that you pull off of the top of a 5-gallon bucket when you want to take the lid off. It's perfect for this right here. You could rip some wood down on your table saw. Maybe you could use popsicle sticks or something like that, but you can't just use spacers. You know, you don't want to put 100,000 spacers underneath there. And if you just put a few of them in there, it's going to make your mat go all wonky. You don't want that. That is not a good look. It gets a border of these little squares, and then it gets inside of that some glass squares that are kind of root beer covered. They almost look like they came off a root beer bottle. Anyway, you can really beat yourself up when you're laying mats like this, trying to get them all perfect. It will drive you bonkers. The glass tiles are pretty good, but those little tiles, man, they're not laid on the mat perfectly. They're pretty good, but they're not perfectly square. You'll find ones that are smaller and crooked and everything else. So I just make my lines nice and straight and then step back and look at it, and if it looks good, it looks good, you know. All those little imperfections, they just add charm. Now when I pull those boards off their screw holes. So I put a screw in the screw hole, and then I cover the head of that screw. Now I'm going back to field tile, as we call it. These are 12 by 12 porcelain, very rough on saw blades as well. Now this inside corner shelf I have laid out in the center of these two tiles. And so, you know, I could get away with making them out of multiple pieces, you know, and if I was getting really frustrated and really just couldn't get it to go, maybe I would go that way, but it was worth it to me to take some time and, you know, get it the way I want it. And when I cut it, again, I cut it so that when it's set in place, it already has fall. It already has some slope to it. Sometimes you need a little extra thin set. This is technically modified thin set mortar. Anyway, if you need a little more, the first step would be to just put some on the wall and on the tile, which is kind of what I've got going on here. And, you know, sometimes you just need to do half of it or one end or whatever. The bottom line is you want it to be flush, but you want it to be sitting on a full bed of mud. You don't want, you know, a spot where it's not stuck, not supported, especially on a floor. On a floor, that's how you end up with tiles popping loose. But you always want a full bed of mud, and you want them, you know, just as flush as you can possibly make them. You can see the remains of a mark. I make pencil marks. I number them or letter them or whatever so that I know where they go after I cut them. Because, you know, the ceilings aren't perfect. Nothing's perfect. So these tiles aren't typically all the same cut. That's just not how it works. Little by little, you get these filled in. I want it pretty tight against the ceiling again. I don't want a gap up there. That's going to grout caulk. It's not going to be a regular grout joint. So I want it pretty tight. Alright, last day of laying tile. I can fill in this bottom row, and I can fill in the sides, and then I just have bullnose to lay after that. Here you get a glimpse of my madness as I spread thin set on the back of all these tiles, which is one of the reasons why it takes me so long to do it. I don't just go in there buck wild and smear, you know, thin set all over the walls and throw tiles on. If you have good success doing it that way, that's fine. I'm not gonna smite you. It's just that I like the extra control. I like my stuff to be nice and flush. It's just hard for me to trust, you know, setting one in. For one thing, you can't dry lay one if it has mastic on the walls, because as soon as you try it on, you've already set it wet, right? And the other thing that happens if you just spread it all over the walls or floor and you don't get it covered in time, well, that thin set just goes bad. You know, the laws of, you know, mass to surface area ratio tells you that when it's in the bucket, it takes it longer to set up than when it's on the floor or on a wall, because it's spread out thin. I mean, it's pretty helpful to not cover up too much. That's something we call flash dry, and if that happens, your tiles can come loose. You know, I've worked in houses where their old tile was popping up, and the reason why is probably, you know, I wasn't there when they laid it, but it is probably because they have put, you know, way too much thin set on the floor and couldn't get it all covered before it had flash dry to it. It didn't get a good bond to the tile. And you can kind of tell as you're peeling that stuff up, the ones that are super easy to peel up or that are already peeled up, those are the ones that were laid after that thin set has been set on the floor for a while. I usually have my process of buttering the back of these tiles down to an art right about the time the job is over and I work on something completely unrelated to tile work for a month or more at a time. I very seldom do, you know, 2 or 3 tile jobs in a row without doing some kind of other work in between. That's just the way it is for me, you know. When I drill holes like this in the tile, I use, of course, a masonry hole saw, but I also keep it really wet. Like, I'll load up a grout sponge and have constant running water across the tile and the hole saw while I drill. This porcelain is super hard, and if you heat up that tile too much while you're drilling it, not only will you wreck your hole saw blade, but you'll also bust the tile. That extra heat just seems to make it that much more brittle. In my opinion, for best results, mark the tiles in place if you can. Also, the water from the saw will wash your pencil mark off, and those, wax pencils just leave a kind of a gray area. They're not real clear. You want a fine line that will stay put. That's what the masking tape on these tiles is for. Not only can I make a nice sharp line to cut, but also it won't be washed off by the saw. Most of your cuts don't actually even show. They get covered with grout caulk, or in the case of an inside corner, the edge of the first tile to go down gets covered with the next tile. So, your cuts need to be good, but not as precise as when they're exposed like these will be. Back to the subject of making a good solid bond between your tile and your floor or wall. I mentioned the importance of getting a full bed of mud and not getting too far ahead of yourself when you apply your mastic or thin set to the wall or the floor. After you cut a tile with your wet saw, you've got to dry that tile off before you lay it. It's just the way it is. And if you've ever attempted to apply thin set to the bottom or to the back of a tile that is wet from being cut, you'll realize that it doesn't stick. You need to dry it off. That's important. One more thing about exposed cuts. When a tile is cut, the edge is sharp. And so for a much better finished product, I take a grindstone and I knock the edge off of that sharp tile and make it more like a factory edge. Finally, onto the bullnose. I want all of my joints on the shower side to continue across through the bullnose. And likewise, the joints on the wall under that stripe of mosaic, I want them to continue on through the bullnose as well. Sometimes that's not an option, or it could be a personal preference. Maybe you want to stagger them halfway or whatever. The smaller the piece, the more accurate the cuts need to be, and the grout joints still need to be consistent. The joints aren't there to make up for inaccurate cuts. The bullnose is going to wrap all the way around the top of this backsplash, but the top of the side splash is too thin. It tapers down to nothing. So my solution here is to just fur it out the thickness of a tile. Just like doing trim work, instead of mitering the inside corners, I cut the first tile square and then coat the second one around it like so. Time for grout. My process has evolved a little over time. Step 1, whip up a batch of grout. Step 2, smear it in the joints, leaving very little on the face of the tile. By the way, in case of unhoned tumbled marble and the like, the grout is going to fill in all those little Swiss cheese holes and everything. That's part of what makes that stuff look so awesome. Step 3, let it set up. The timing's kind of important. You'll see here in a little bit. Step 4, give it a scrub. The scrubber will strike the joints. Step 5, wet sponge. Let it dry again. Step 6, when it is totally dry and set up, give it a buff with a terry cloth. If you're doing a huge area or something very complicated or difficult, don't whip up too much. Don't bite off more than you can chew, because if it sets up, if it gets away from you, oh, you are going to hate life. Alright, so I finally have all my tile laid and I have it all grouted, but I still have a couple more steps. I'm going to run grout caulk all the way around the tub, all my inside corners. Inside corner here and here and here and here and here. Everywhere, all the way around the ceiling at the top of the shower, where the tile meets the wall, where the wall meets the floor. All of that stuff is going to get grout caulk. And so I'll show you what that looks like. So grout caulk is basically just a silicone product that happens to look an awful lot like our regular sanded grout. And the advantage to using it is that it doesn't crack. Every time you have surfaces that can move independently of each other, even a little bit, there's a possibility that a regular mortar grout joint can crack. So you could do little repairs to joints that were previously cracked with it, little touch-up stuff like that. But what I use it for is more preventive. And I'm going to go around all these surfaces around this room this way. And it is time consuming, and it is possible to apply, you know, a coat of caulking to an inside corner without masking off. But I can assure you, you cannot get a better end result than doing it this way. It is a little labor intensive, but it's totally worth it. I want to basically replicate my 1/8 inch size joint in all of these grout caulk joints so that it just looks like all the other joints. One thing that I see a lot of people do when they go to open a tube of caulk is they just slice that dude wide open. You don't want to do that. It'll just be a mess, and you'll waste caulk. You'll have it everywhere. Less is more in this case. Make a pretty small hole in there, and it'll help control the flow a little bit. Now, most of these tubes that are all the same color like this is all molded white. Chances are you don't have to, you know, run a screw or one of these probes down in. Usually don't need that when they're all one color like that. And this is no exception to that rule. Now I'm just going to start up here at the top, and I don't want to get too far ahead of myself because this stuff does start to set up pretty quick. Okay, I'm just gonna strike it down like so, and then with whatever's left, I'll keep going. All right, and keep moving. One of the easiest places to mess up is these inside corners. It can really make your hands sore, your fingers sore by trying to get that knocked down. Now, a lot of people will try to tell me that the tape is not necessary, or maybe they'll try to use one of those rubber pieces, and you know, maybe they have success with that, but this is what works best for me. If it ain't broke, don't fix it, you know? Now, ideally, I want to be able to see the edge of the tape. If I can see the edge of the tape through that bead of caulking, then I know it's going to peel off clean. If I have, you know, a big, thick bead on there that goes way out here to the sides of the tape, then it'll trap the tape underneath, and then when I go to peel the tape off, there's only you know, two results. They're both bad. The tape will either be trapped, you'll pull it, it'll be stuck back behind there. You'll have to try to cut it, or maybe even worse, you go to pull it out and it takes all of your caulking with it. Neither one of those things are good, I promise. There we go. Excellent. But anyway, I'm going to start at the top. This is 511 Sealant Enhance. I'm going to start at the top because everything's going to run downward. And I'm just going to liberally spread this stuff over there. It doesn't really matter, you know, how aggressive you are at putting this stuff on, how thick you put it on. It's going to absorb as much of it as it can, and we're going to let the stuff sit for a while, and then we're just going to wipe it down. And I usually put numerous coats on. You don't have to do that, but I've gotten the best results. Now, before I jump to the top, I'm going to put just a little bit on this inlay so you can see how that's going to look. You can see it darkens everything up just a little bit. It's a little bit like, you know, putting a clear coat on your paint job. It just makes everything a little brighter, gives it a little sheen, makes it easier to clean. Now you see it's foaming up a little bit. I want to knock those bubbles back out of there. I don't want bubbles in my sealer. But other than that, you know, it doesn't really matter a whole lot how you get it on here. You know, you don't have to worry about runs. You don't have to worry about it, you know, dripping down. It's just a transparent, you know, really runny, drippy stuff. Kind of working it into the grout a little bit. Since the grout is, you know, what's going to take sealer, the glass isn't porous enough to absorb anything, but the grout is. So that is about it for the tile work. See you next time, and thanks for watching.